My name is Vincent Ordonez, and I am 74 years old. 3 weeks ago, at an upscale restaurant downtown, celebrating what I believed was a genuine family dinner with my son, his wife, and two of his business colleagues, my son leaned toward me near the end of the meal and said, quietly but firmly, that I should just pay the bill and head home, that he and his colleagues had some further business discussion planned that didn't really require my presence for the rest of the evening. What my son didn't know, folding his napkin and gesturing toward the check the waiter had just placed on the table, was that I had personally owned that restaurant, along with the two others under the same small hospitality group, for the past 11 years, and that the waiter standing quietly beside our table had known me by name since the day the doors first opened. If you've ever been quietly dismissed by your own child in a room you actually built, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about embarrassing my son in front of his colleagues. It's about what happens when a man finally decides that being underestimated in his own establishment has gone on one dinner too long. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened when that waiter spoke. I need to tell you who I was before I tell you about that dinner table, because otherwise a simple restaurant bill won't carry the weight it's actually supposed to carry. I spent the first half of my working life as a line cook and eventually a sous chef in restaurants across Chicago, starting at 19 years old washing dishes in a kitchen that taught me, through sheer necessity, every single station a restaurant actually needs to function. I remember those early years vividly, 16-hour shifts during which I moved between stations as needed, learning the specific rhythm of a busy dinner service, the particular pressure of a kitchen at its peak hour, when every ticket printing represented another family waiting to be fed properly and on time. I worked my way up over nearly 2 decades, learning the business from the ground floor, understanding intimately the specific mechanics of running a kitchen, managing food costs, training staff who often arrived with considerably less experience than the job demanded. I remember specifically the particular satisfaction of finally being trusted to run my own station, a modest promotion that felt, at the time, like genuinely arriving somewhere significant, though I understood even then that true ownership, the kind that would let me shape an entire establishment according to my own vision, remained years away. I saved carefully during those years, living considerably below my modest salary, understanding that the particular dream I was building toward would require capital I couldn't simply earn through wages alone. In my early 40s, after years of careful saving and one genuinely fortunate investment in a small commercial property that appreciated considerably more than I'd anticipated, I finally had enough capital to open my own place, a modest Italian restaurant that I built, quite literally, with my own hands over the following 2 years, doing much of the renovation work myself to keep costs manageable enough to actually make the venture possible. I remember specific nights, working alone in that empty space long after any reasonable person would have gone home, laying tile and building the bar myself, understanding every square foot of that restaurant in a way that no amount of hired contracting could have ever replicated. That first restaurant succeeded beyond anything I genuinely expected, and over the following 2 decades I expanded carefully, opening 2 additional locations under a small hospitality group I built and continued to personally oversee, though I made a deliberate choice. Once the business reached a certain scale, to remain largely behind the scenes, letting general managers and head chefs handle the day-to-day public-facing operations, while I focused on the broader strategic and financial oversight that kept all 3 locations genuinely thriving. I found, somewhere in that transition from working chef to business owner, a particular satisfaction in the quieter, less visible work of ensuring an entire operation ran smoothly, a satisfaction that never required the public recognition that a more visible role might have demanded. I want to be honest about something that matters enormously to understanding the rest of this story. I never made a habit of discussing the specific scope of my business with my own family in much detail. Part of this reflected simple modesty, a preference I've carried my entire life for letting work speak through results rather than conversation. Part of it, I think, reflected a deliberate choice to keep my son's understanding of me rooted in who I was as his father, rather than any particular business success, wanting our relationship to exist somewhere separate from whatever financial accomplishments I'd built. My wife Rosa passed 7 years ago, and she had, throughout our 41 years of marriage, a full and genuine understanding of everything I'd built, having worked alongside me during those early years, managing the books for our first restaurant with a precision that taught me more about actual business discipline than any of my own kitchen experience ever had. Rosa had a particular gift for numbers that I never quite matched myself, and I credit her, more than any decision I made independently, with the careful financial discipline that allowed our first modest success to eventually grow into 3 thriving locations rather than remaining a single precarious venture. Since her passing, I've continued living a quiet, unassuming life, driving a practical car, wearing simple clothing, giving no particular outward indication of the actual scope of what those 3 restaurants had become. Finding, in that continued modesty, a way of honoring the same values Rosa and I had always shared, about how we wanted to live regardless of what we'd actually built. We raised one son, Marco, who grew up watching his father work impossibly long hours in restaurant kitchens throughout his childhood, understanding in general terms that I worked in restaurants, without ever developing much specific curiosity about the actual ownership structure or financial scope of what that work had eventually become. I remember Marco visiting the first restaurant occasionally as a young boy, watching me work the line during a busy dinner service, absorbing an impression of his father as someone who cooked professionally rather than someone building toward eventual ownership and expansion. By the time our second and third locations opened, Marco was already away at college, missing the specific transition that might have given him a clearer picture of how significantly the business had grown beyond that first modest restaurant. Marco built his own career in corporate consulting, a field considerably removed from the restaurant industry, and over the years, I noticed him develop, gradually, an assumption that my career represented a modest, working-class trade rather than genuine business ownership, an assumption I never corrected, partly out of habit and partly because the topic simply never arose in a context requiring clarification. I remember, more than once at family gatherings, Marco making passing references to my restaurant work, in a tone that suggested he understood it as something considerably smaller and less significant than what it had actually become. References I let pass without correction, telling myself, each time, that the specific scope of my success wasn't information Marco particularly needed access to. 3 weeks ago, Marco invited me to dinner at what he described as a really excellent restaurant downtown, wanting me to meet 2 colleagues he was hoping to impress ahead of an important business decision they were apparently considering together. I recognized the restaurant's name immediately when he mentioned it, one of my own 3 locations, though I said nothing at the time, curious to see how the evening might unfold without revealing my connection to the establishment up front. A small private amusement I allowed myself given how confidently Marco had described the place, as though he were introducing me to something entirely unfamiliar. We arrived, and I watched, with genuine amusement I kept carefully hidden, as Marco confidently guided our small group through the restaurant, commenting knowledgeably on the menu, clearly wanting to project the impression of someone comfortable and sophisticated in exactly this kind of setting, gesturing toward specific dishes he recommended, with the easy authority of a regular patron rather than someone whose own father had personally selected the flooring beneath his feet. Our server, a young woman named Teresa who had worked for me for nearly 6 years, recognized me instantly upon seating us, her eyes widening slightly before she caught herself and greeted our table with entirely professional composure, clearly understanding, without needing explicit instruction, that I preferred to observe how the evening developed before revealing anything. The dinner proceeded pleasantly enough through the appetizers and main courses, Marco's colleagues, 2 men named Whitfield and Sanders, engaging in the kind of professional networking conversation typical of these business dinners, occasionally including me politely, but clearly treating me as a peripheral presence rather than a genuine participant in whatever discussion Marco was hoping to advance. I noticed, throughout the meal, The particular quality of the service Teresa and her colleagues provided, small details I recognized as reflecting training protocols I'd personally established years earlier, the timing of course transitions, the specific way water glasses were refilled without interrupting conversation, small operational choices that had become, over years of careful management, simply how things were done at this particular establishment. As dessert plates were cleared and the check arrived, placed discreetly at the edge of the table by Teresa, Marco glanced at his watch and then leaned toward me, his voice pitched low but audible enough that I heard every word clearly. "Dad, why don't you go ahead and take care of the bill? And I think we're going to stick around a bit longer for some actual business talk. You don't need to stay for that part, obviously. I'll call you tomorrow." He said it easily, almost affectionately, the tone of someone who genuinely believed he was being considerate, sparing his father from a conversation that wouldn't interest him, while simultaneously making clear that my presence for the remainder of the evening wasn't particularly wanted. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though a specific sting was certainly present, the particular discomfort of being quietly dismissed from a table by my own son, treated as someone present merely to cover a bill, rather than a genuine participant in whatever significance he'd assigned to that evening. What I felt, more than anything, was a tired, familiar recognition that decades of my own chosen modesty had shaped entirely my son's understanding of exactly what I represented in a room like this one. I looked at the check Teresa had placed on the table, then looked up and caught her eye briefly, and something in my expression must have communicated that the moment had arrived, because she stepped forward with the particular composed professionalism she'd always brought to difficult situations. "Mr. Ordonez," she said, addressing me directly rather than the table generally, "would you like me to comp this evening's meal, the way we normally handle it when you're dining here?" The table went completely silent. Marco's expression shifted from mild confusion into something considerably more startled as he processed what Teresa had just said. The specific familiarity in her tone, the use of Mr. Ordonez delivered with obvious professional deference rather than any generic customer service formality. "I'm sorry," Whitfield said slowly, looking between Teresa and me. "Did you just ask if he wanted the meal comped? Do you two know each other?" Teresa glanced at me, a small, questioning look, asking permission to explain further, and I nodded slightly. "Mr. Ordonez owns this restaurant," she said. "Along with our two sister locations, he's owned all three for the past 11 years. I've worked here for 6 of those years, and he's always been kind enough to stop by periodically to check in on operations, though he usually prefers not to make a scene about it. I want you to understand what that table looked like in that moment." Marco's face had gone completely pale. His earlier confident, slightly dismissive posture entirely evaporated. Whitfield and Sanders exchanged a stunned glance, clearly recalculating everything about the man they'd spent the last hour treating as a peripheral presence at their business dinner. "Dad," Marco said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you own this restaurant?" "I do," I said, keeping my voice level. "I have for 11 years. I own the restaurant where you just told me to pay the bill and head home so you and your colleagues could have your actual conversation without me." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. My first instinct was not entirely generous. Part of me wanted to let the silence stretch out a while longer, let Marco fully absorb the specific weight of what he'd just said, in front of his colleagues, inside a room I had built with my own hands decades earlier. But I thought of Rosa, and the grace she always modeled, and I found something steadier instead. "Marco," I said, "I'm not upset because I need you to know the specifics of what I've built. I've never needed anyone's recognition for these 3 restaurants to feel proud of what they represent. But I do think it's worth sitting with what just happened here. You brought me to a business dinner and, without knowing it, asked me to pay for a meal in an establishment I actually own, then asked me to leave so you could have a more important conversation elsewhere in the same room. I think that says something worth examining about how completely you've underestimated what your own father actually built with his life." Marco was quiet for a long moment, clearly working through genuine shame, his hands folded on the table in front of him, no longer touching the check that had started this entire exchange. Dad, I am so sorry. I've spent my whole life thinking of your career as just working in restaurants, some modest trade you did before retirement, and I never once asked real questions about what that actually meant in terms of scale or ownership. I feel like an idiot sitting here right now, especially in front of Whitfield and Sanders. You're not an idiot, I said. You're a man who was given a fairly vague picture of his own father's career and never had much reason to question it further, partly because I never volunteered more detail myself. I own some responsibility for that gap too. I think somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that staying quiet about the specifics of my success reflected a kind of humility I genuinely valued, without fully considering what that silence might eventually cost in terms of how clearly you understood who I actually was. Whitfield and Sanders, to their credit, spent the remainder of that evening treating me with an entirely different level of engagement, genuinely curious about the business decisions behind building and running 3 successful restaurants. Questions I answered honestly, watching Marco listen alongside them with an expression of dawning, considerable pride, occasionally adding his own observations once he'd had a few minutes to process the shift in his understanding of the conversation. Sanders, in particular, asked several detailed questions about the specific financial structure of expanding from 1 location to 3, questions that Marco listened to with genuine interest, clearly absorbing information about his own father that he'd never previously had access to. In the 3 weeks since that dinner, something has genuinely shifted in how Marco relates to me. He's asked, more than once, real questions about the actual business, about specific decisions I made building each location, about the particular challenges of running a hospitality business across multiple properties. He visited the restaurant again last week, this time asking if he could actually see the kitchen operations and speak with my general manager about how the business actually functions day to day, wanting, in his words, to finally understand something he'd apparently spent his entire adult life not bothering to ask about. He spent nearly 2 hours in that kitchen, watching the dinner service unfold from the same vantage point I once occupied as a young cook decades earlier, asking my general manager detailed questions about staffing, inventory management, and the particular financial discipline required to keep 3 locations consistently profitable. Marco also called Whitfield directly, I later learned, to have a more honest conversation about the business proposal they'd been discussing that evening, wanting to clarify certain assumptions Whitfield and Sanders had apparently made about Marco's own family background during their earlier conversation. Assumptions that Marco felt had shaped the dynamic of that dinner in ways he wanted to address directly now that the full picture had come to light. He told me during a recent phone call that the entire experience had made him reconsider how he'd been representing himself professionally, wondering how many other assumptions he'd built about his own background that simply weren't accurate once he actually stopped to examine them. Rosa's memory came up more than once during our conversations in the weeks since, Marco asking me, for what felt like the first time in years, real questions about what she'd actually contributed to building those first foundations, wanting to understand the fuller partnership behind the business, rather than simply crediting my own individual effort. I found myself telling him stories about her careful bookkeeping, her sharp instincts about which potential business partners to trust and which to avoid, details I'd never fully shared with him before, partly because the opportunity to share them had simply never arisen naturally until this specific conversation opened the door. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old restaurant owner asked to pay a bill and leave by his own son. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The people who love us sometimes build entire assumptions about our worth and our accomplishments based on incomplete pictures we ourselves, through habit or modesty, never bothered to correct. That doesn't mean our actual worth was ever less than what we'd built. It means the truth was simply waiting, patiently, for the right moment to finally speak for itself, sometimes through nothing more dramatic than a waitress asking a simple, familiar question at exactly the right moment. I spent decades quietly building 3 successful restaurants while my own son understood my career as little more than a modest trade he'd long since moved past in his own more visible profession. It took one careless comment at a business dinner and one waitress's simple question about comping a meal to finally reveal exactly how much he'd never bothered to ask about the man who raised him. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual accomplishments you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.